Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Good afternoon. My name is Molly Ball. I am the national political correspondent for Time Magazine. I am so pleased to be back at the Commonwealth Club to moderate today's program, focusing on the great new book, Majority Minority, by Justin Guest, Associate Professor of Policy and Government at George Mason University. And I am pleased that Justin is here to speak about his book, along with the former mayor of Los Angeles, Antonio Villaraigosa, who knows these issues firsthand from his leadership of America's second largest city. As the country continues to discuss the 2020 election and prepares for 2022 and 2024, the impact of America's continuing evolution as a multiracial democracy continues to draw attention across the political spectrum. Majority minority obviously refers to a time when whites are a minority in the United States, a landmark that the demographers tell us is fast approaching. Yet the impact of these changing demographics on our politics is happening now, and they are constantly changing. It's not just one impact, it is many, and Justin's new book is unique and fascinating in the way that it focuses on case studies of 6 societies that have undergone this majority-minority transition. We obviously have a lot to learn from these examples, and we will discuss them here today. A quick note before we jump into today's program: if you have a question as we're talking for Justin or Mayor Villaraigosa, please put it in the YouTube chat box. Questions there will be forwarded to me during the program, and I will get to as many of them as possible, and we'll carve out some time specifically for questions near the end. With that said, let's get started. I want to start by throwing it out to you, Justin, to just talk a little about your book, introduce us to the concept, and tell us how you decided to pursue this particular research.
Sure. Thank you so much, Molly, and thank you to you and Mayor Villaraigosa and the Commonwealth Club for joining this event. This book is something that's both very personal, but also emerges from my own professional trajectory. I grew up in Los Angeles, California, and I went to Los Angeles Unified School District schools, which were at the time even majority minority already. And so in many ways, I think Los Angeles in the 1990s presaged the demographic shifts that, of course, will soon beset the entire country. And so, I feel like I was raised in a majority minority society and conscious of its politics from an early stage. But then as I pursued my research over the course of my career, I studied many subjects in the fields of immigration and the politics of demographic change, everything from minority politics to the politics of nativism and white working class people. And really, in many ways, this book feels like a sort of culmination of those things. At its core, the book is really about how societies respond to great demographic change. Even though that majority minority milestone that you mentioned is still off, a ways into the future, in many ways, the politics and the specter of that change overshadow, today's current affairs in the United States and the way Americans understand their country and I think themselves. At the core of the book's argument, I really push hard against the idea that we will only be able to adapt to this demographic change once, we are able to eradicate racism and prejudice, which are obviously vexing scourges in American society and worldwide. But if we wait until that's all eradicated to make progress, we're going to be waiting a very long time. What I find in those 6 societies that you thoughtfully mentioned is that in many ways, racism and prejudice, these are the components of the turf on which progress must be made. Even in the societies that adapted best to demographic change, prejudice persisted. And so, I think that's a humbling reality, but it also means that the key is not the eradication of prejudice and racism. It actually means that majority minority milestones are inherently governed. They're subject to the management of political leaders, business leaders, civil society leaders, their institutions that they promote, the policies that they pass, and the rhetoric that they use. And all of that, of course, yields certain critical junctures where society can pivot towards coexistence on the one hand or conflict on the other.
So, Mayor Villaraigosa, as you hear Justin talk about this, do you agree with what he's saying? And what questions does it raise for you? What does it resonate with in your experience, particularly in governing a large, diverse city?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Commonwealth Club for inviting me here today. Once again, been there, I think 2 times now. This is the 3rd. Justin, thank you for your books, rather. I think this is a fascinating exploration of the dynamics of change, demographic change around the world, and certainly here in, with impact here in the United States. And Molly, it's an honor to be here with you. Look, I found it fascinating because intuitively I understood from the beginning. I started out as a student, a leader with the Black Student Union and then the United Mexican American Students. Was involved in the Third World Coalition, involved in a progressive coalition around the bombings in Cambodia. And I remember early on that it was really important to reach out to a broad cross-section of people. When I first, I was president of a union that was probably 65% African-American. And I knew that to be a leader that they respected, I had to understand, them and the others in that union. And over the years, when I first ran for office, I ran the state assembly for, in a civil rights created district. The Voting Rights Act required that they not, redistrict people of color, in this case, Latinos, in a way that would undermine their voting power. We were a majority in that district, but a very small minority of voters. And so I intuitively understood I had to explain and project the fact that I wanted to be a leader for everybody. And all along the way, I was majority whip, majority leader and speaker in the 90s. I ran for mayor in 2001, which we can talk about in a minute. But at every turn, I understood that to break a glass ceiling, to shatter it, I had to demonstrate that I was a leader for all of us. I was oftentimes criticized among Latinos as not being Latino enough, even though my entire life had been involved in the Chicano movement and the civil rights movement. I understood that the criticism used to be that I was always with the Blacks and the Jews. And what I said to people, well, they live here too. I want to be a mayor for all of us. I'm fascinated by, what Justin has been studying over the years, because I think LA's lived it. And I think more and more cities across the country, and as we've seen in his book, other nations have lived it. And certainly interested in exploring that in the course of this interview.
Yeah, and Justin, one of the things that I found so fascinating reading the book was the ways in which our sort of narrow American conceptions of quote unquote identity politics and the dynamics that Mayor Villaraigosa describes intersect in interesting ways and then don't overlap in some interesting ways with what happens in these other societies, many of which are dealing with, legacies of colonialism and migration, which of course we have here too. Can you talk a little bit about some of those examples that you studied and how you think they do and don't map onto what's happening here in the United States?
Sure. Thanks, Molly. In many ways, YouTube is not the best platform to really get into detail about each of these very complicated and interesting societies. But I'll give you a brief overview. So I studied 3 different types of places that I sort of categorized by the outcomes of the demographic change in its politics. So I study Singapore and Bahrain. Singapore, the Southeast Asian city-state; Bahrain, the island off the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, which both are really subject to suppression, where ethnic or religious minorities are subject to state-sponsored suppression in some way or another. And of course, both of these are autocracies. Then I study Mauritius and Trinidad and Tobago. Mauritius, an island off the coast of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. Trinidad and Tobago, a pair of islands in the East Caribbean Sea, which are democracies and are subject to really racialized politics and seemingly, intractable ethnic tension. And then I study Hawaii and New York. And of course, most Americans know where these places are. But Hawaii is not a state in the case of this book. It's actually its own country, because up until the American government forcibly annexed Hawaii in 1893, Hawaii was its own country, a sovereign monarchy, obviously as an archipelago in the Central Pacific Ocean. And then New York City in New York, of course, is never its own country, even if New Yorkers wish it were. New York, however, had sovereign control over its immigration policy up until 1882, when all of immigration policy was federalized in the United States. And those two societies, Hawaii and New York, were different. They weren't subject to major suppression. They weren't subject to intractable ethnic tension. They were subject to something different, a sort of redefinition of what it means to be Hawaiian, what it means to be an American. And that reconstitution of an identity sets them apart from the other cases. And so I study all six together comparatively. And in many ways, they have a lot in common. We see a very consistent sort of set of events that take place on their chronological path towards a majority-minority milestone. They begin with colonialism, the industrialization of labor forces, and the commoditization of agriculture, often slavery and indentured servitude, a lot of segregation. But then they start to sort of, they start to diverge when it comes to whether you enfranchise minority groups and how you construct the national or societal identity. And that's what really leads to these differences, I find, across the different societies. So, our viewers today are welcome to sort of double click on any of these six societies by reading their respective chapters in the book, but I'm also happy to take questions about them too.
Well, and everyone, of course, should buy the book and read every word of it and study it closely and potentially assign it in their undergraduate seminars. But Mayor Villaraigosa, you put your finger on one of the really interesting and key points of Justin's book, right, which is that political leaders have to make decisions about how they're going to lead and whether they are going to try to be leaders for everyone or to be more factional leaders or to lead, based on a certain conception of identity. Talk a little bit. You mentioned how difficult that choice can be when you're facing pressure from your own group in some cases. Talk through how you approach that decision and why and how you tried to be more inclusive in your approach to politics.
It started with my mom. My mom raised us. Mom was a single mom. Father was an alcoholic and, lived in a home of domestic violence. My mom was a second generation American of Mexican descent. She'd always tell us that we should be proud to be an American, but also proud of our heritage. And so early on, I understand. In the 1950s, we had Japanese Americans, Jews, African Americans, and looking back, even a gay couple at our home for dinner. My mother was a very open, socially progressive, not necessarily politically, but very open to other groups. And so I grew up in that environment. I also grew up in a place called Boyle Heights, which was the Ellis Island of Los Angeles. It's where the Jews came early on. There were Japanese Americans and Latinos in big numbers. Also African Americans and Armenians, White Russians, but mostly Japanese Americans, Jews, Latinos and Japanese Americans. And I think that social milieu gave me a comfort in different communities. And I've read in the past about cultural intelligence. And I think those of us who have this sense of understanding, empathy, but importantly, respect for the different cultures, it wasn't a difficult transition for me to try to be a leader for all of us. I knew my base would be Latinos, and it was, but I knew that if I could make it clear that I was going to be a leader for all of us, that I would be a successful leader in a multiracial, multi-ethnic polyglot. I've often said when I speak about LA, I said, LA doesn't care who your father was. In my case, they didn't care that I didn't have one. And today, they don't care if you have two of them. LA says, just do it. And in so many ways, I think that's why Justin picked, a former mayor of Los Angeles, because, we reveled, and in the time that I was in public office, I reveled in the notion that we really are a harbinger of what the future was going to be like in the United States of America. The intermarriage among us. I think with Latinos, 40% of their intermarriages are with whites and others, and in so many of our communities, there's an interaction. I think, although we're still segregated, an interaction that has opened us to the breadth of diversity and also the richness of our diversity. We come from everywhere, every corner of the earth, to plant our flag here and to reach for the stars and follow our dreams.
Well, Mayor, if I can stick with you for a minute, we're talking about a nation that's becoming more diverse, in many ways a nation that's coming to resemble Los Angeles more, although Los Angeles obviously has a history not only of diversity, but of racial conflict as well. And many people feel like our country's divisions aren't getting better, that they're deepening, that as we become more diverse, we are becoming, more segregated, more alienated, that we're having trouble getting along. Do you feel like the trajectory is positive or negative in terms of how we're doing with this transition as we approach it?
I was always honest about, not Pollyannish, but honest about our history. I remember when I invited Xi Jinping to Los Angeles, I in that speech with President Biden, Governor Jerry Brown there, 300 leaders from all over California, I reminded us that we had a sordid history with Chinese immigration, that we had lynched Chinese in California and Los Angeles, that we have a racialized history that we shouldn't be proud of. By the same token, I talked about, the progress we've made over the decades. President Obama always used to talk about that we're always striving to make us a more perfect union, to put real teeth and truth to the founding fathers. And there were mothers along the way, but the founding fathers' conception of that all men are created equal. We know that at the time they meant white men, and only white men that were propertied. They didn't mean Native Americans or African Americans or any of the other ethnics that have come here. So I think it's important to be honest about that, but not to dwell on it, not to focus on it constantly, to talk about the opportunities that come with, as I said, this richness that comes with the diversity. You look at Korean American immigrants as an example. I'm very proud of the fact that, they used to say when I was in Korea, and I visited them some 5 times, had, I believe, 2 presidents over my home, that we had the 7th largest Korean population. What an inspiration they were when you'd see them working 14 and 16 hours a day, their kids getting, reading and getting educated and, studying rather, and then going on to great success. The Latino immigrants, that have started from nothing with a shirt on their back and have made it, and the many other communities. You look at what African Americans have had to go through in this country with centuries of slavery, Jim Crow, and this continued level of discrimination, I think that shouldn't be tolerated in a country like ours, and see all the success among them. And I choose to always acknowledge our past and what we're, and the struggles that we have to overcome, but also to to celebrate that this is a great place. It's not a perfect place. We need to make it better. And we need to work together to do what New York did in many ways. And, Justin chronicled that in his book. Initially, whites were white Protestants from England and maybe the Netherlands and Germany and a little bit of France. And over time, it included the Irish and the Italians and the Southern Europeans. And I think we want to see the same thing happen. And I hope the same thing happens, and I believe it will, with Latinos and Asians and Africans, African Americans. And so that's the challenge before us.
Well, and Justin, let me ask you a version of that same question, because as you mentioned in your book, you described the choice that these diversifying societies have to either pivot to coexistence or pivot to conflict, that sort of wonderful formulation. Which track do you think the United States is on?
Yeah, Molly, it's such a complicated question, right? Because we're such a complicated country. We also have different levels of governance, which make it challenging to really make a decision here. What you see in the United States are countervailing pressures and countervailing outcomes. On the one hand, there are tons of pivots towards inclusion, whether it's in the space of the arts and sports and music, whether it's in commerce and the interdependencies of our economic system, whether it's in the socialization of our youth into integrated schools, that are championing diversity and talking about our nation's complicated history. On the other hand, there are countervailing pressures going the other direction. We are consumed by a sense of nationalism and nostalgia right now. Many people feel discomforted by the threat of demographic change. And as a result, we see also pressures towards exclusion through the hardening of different identities, through the inflammation of politics around school curriculum and curricula, the creation of domestic threats, people perceiving that the greatest threat to their society is internal, the other political side, and the polarization that results. And so in many ways, I think that the United States is at a crossroads, that we are sort of teetering between the politics of coexistence and conflict. And in many ways, it's not actually being led at the national level because these politics are absolutely paralyzing. We see gridlock and a stalemate nationally. And so states and municipalities have stepped into that void. And that's where you're really seeing these cross currents. So really, whether we're pivoting towards conflict or coexistence, inclusivity or exclusivity, depends on where you look in the United States.
Mayor Villaraigosa, how concerned are you? I mean, I know you said that you're an optimist and you try to see the best in America, but a lot of people in our political system are very alarmed about the future of our democracy and whether it can be sustained given this deep polarization, these deep divisions. How worried are you?
I want to return to the issue of my optimism about the future, but with respect to the issue of race and ethnicity, but with respect to our democracy, I'm very concerned. I think we see an assault on democracy, not just here in the United States, but around the world. You see it in Latin America, you see it in Europe. We obviously see it in Asia and Africa. From my vantage point, that is, the notion of a liberal democracy, separation of powers. These are important things, a capitalism that should work for more of us. I think are challenges facing the nation and the world. I think all of us are watching with horror what's happening in the Ukraine, where a dictator it was not just invaded a country, but is attempting to turn that country into a vassal state, a satellite, if you will, without the kind of democratic institutions that I think are important and I think are the best way to get to the optimism that I spoke about. Let me share something. I'm assuming that I was asked to be here not because I'm an expert, but because I've lived some of this. When I first ran for mayor, I started out 9%. I was Speaker of the Assembly. 9% of the people knew me. The primary opponent, 76% of the people knew him. 3% said they would vote for me. A year later, I beat him in the primary, and I lost in the runoff. I lost in the runoff in no small part because they did an attack ad that used crime and the specter of crime to marginalize me, to make me look scary, to remind people that of the changing demographics in our town. There were times when I would extend my hand because I would do 40-hour bus tours, 24-hour bus tours. I'd go all over the town. I'd extend my hand to people, and on a few occasions, they spit on the ground, hit my hand and say, "Get your hand away from me." I remember an incident not so long, a decade ago. I was Speaker of the Assembly. People saying, "Go back to Mexico." In fact, Dan, I won't say his name, but a reporter, columnist, wrote a story about the fact that they said, "Go back to Mexico." I have seen the ugly face of discrimination and hate, but I've also seen great things happen. In his book, Justin talks about the role of leadership. I stuck to the story of we're a great town, and we're a great town because we come here from every corner of the earth with the same dreams and the same hopes and aspirations, yearning to be free. And over time, I lost that first election. And by the way, the newspaper of record in the primary in 2001 referred to me at every turn as the Latino candidate for mayor. I had to take it all the way to the publisher and ask why. And they said, "Why are you so sensitive about it?" And I said, "Because you're telling people I'm different. I was born and raised here. My grandpa got here 100 years ago." They said, "Well, you'd be making history." And I said, "Well, there's a woman running. She'd be making history. You don't call her the female candidate. There's a Jew running. He'd be making history. You don't call him the Jew candidate. There's a gay candidate running, and you don't call him the gay candidate. I know what you're doing. I think a lot of people know what you're doing." In the runoff, they didn't call me the Latino candidate anymore. But I joke, I lost that election. I won 4 years later. And 8 years after that, a gentleman, the current mayor, who had about an eighth of Latino heritage, ran as a Latino. And I tell people, wow, what a difference a few years make after all these years saying, I want to bring people together. Let's talk about what we have in common. Let's celebrate the differences and focus on our commonalities. A candidate runs as a Latino candidate, something I tried to avoid from the beginning. They tried to paint me as, but in the end, I think people saw me as a uniter and somebody that wanted to bring us together.
Well, Justin, one of the things, and you alluded to this, one of the things I find so interesting about this book is the way that you came to it, right? Your previous book being about the white working class here in America. Let's talk about American politics and talk about that connection and how the one led to the other, and what you think are the political implications of these demographic shifts we're talking about.
Sure, Molly, and this ties in directly with what Mayor Villaraigosa was just describing about his experience in campaigning and in office. Over the course of my research on white working class people, both here in the United States and also in Britain, and of course, all that research took place before the election of Donald Trump and before the passage of Brexit in Britain. So in many ways, it was a sort of unbiased look at this group of people that really made history, for better and worse. What I found is that demographic change and the shadow of it was inescapable from their politics, inescapable from their mindset and their lens that they applied to their country's politics and to their local politics. And so, it was only sort of natural for me to want to explore this further. by broadening it out into greater context. So many Americans think that what we're doing in the United States is exceptional, that it's this great experiment. And in many ways, of course, so much of America is exceptional. We are a very exceptional place, maybe more than we ever really fully appreciate. But in this case, we're not. There are other countries or others in other societies that have undergone this majority-minority milestone, this great flip of demographic change, and have endured the politics of its specter. And we can learn from them. They're microcosms. They're all small islands around the world with fragile demographies. But in many ways, the United States is a bit of an island, a sort of fortress, and a crossroads of the world that many islands are. And so I think we have a lot to learn from these places to contextualize our politics. But let me return back for a moment to what the mayor just described. This was all political candidates have to be strategic in order to win. And the mayor determined that in the Los Angeles of the 1990s, that it was imperative that he not be understood as just a candidate that is associated with a particular identity group. That certain Latino candidates today no longer feel that is imperative. It's a product of how identity politics have now started to consume, I think, general democratic politics in the United States. And this is dangerous for a whole host of reasons. One is the racialization of political parties, no doubt. And we see that at the national level here right now in the United States. The vast majority of ethnic and racial and religious minorities support the Democratic Party on balance. And the Republican Party is about 85% white. So 5 out of every 6, if not more, white people or Republicans are in fact white. And the problem with that, of course, is that the parties then play to these ethnic groups and they play on identity politics, which makes people think that their political opponents pose existential threats. And that is dangerous for a democracy because people are less willing to lose and more willing to break the rules in order to win, which create these threats to democracy that the mayor fears. But even beyond that, they narrow our understanding of our fellow man down to the salience of their race, ethnicity, or religious backgrounds. And they hinder the sense of linked fate that builds societies together. Further, what they're doing right now, particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle, is that they're leading to some complacency. The idea that just because of your ethnic or racial background that you can and deserve to win, rather than actually leading with policy ideas, with vision for the country, with something that appeals to all. Great rewards await those who actually appeal narrowly to stir up a fervor and mobilize voters to get to the polls with the sense of that existential threat. And so the cycle is basically reinforced by the incentives that our system creates when we have identity politics at the fore.
Mayor, what do you think of that? And particularly when it comes to the Democratic Party, right? There have been so many conversations over the past several years about the Democratic Party's loss of white working class voters, and more recently, the slippage of Latino voters who are tired of being told you can't vote for that person, he's a racist, and are looking outside of that paradigm at different choices. What do you see happening there? And particularly, what is your advice to the Democratic Party?
First of all, I don't think I agree with Justin on the demographics of both parties. I don't think Democrats have a monopoly on good ideas necessarily with respect to communities of color. They talk a great game, but don't always come through, if you will. I'm not an expert in this regard. I can only tell you of my own experience. Intuitively, I understood that if I had a shot at breaking a glass ceiling, and I've broken a couple now in my life, I needed to focus on our commonalities, not on our differences. And that's what I tried to do at every turn. Some time is more successful than others. In the governor's race in a very blue party, whites voted for the winner 3-1. He was white. Latinos voted for me 3-1, and as I understand, Asians voted overwhelmingly as well for the Asian candidate. And so even among Democrats, to what do you ascribe that overwhelmingly support for a member of their own tribe, if you will? I don't know. I think we need to study it. I do think, however, it's that leadership matters. And at every turn, I joke with the Greeks, I was via Ragosopoulos. With the Armenians, I was via Ragosian. With the Persians, I was via Ragosian. I was a brother in the African American community. I mean, people saw that I was always present. Jews, and I'm not just talking about the more liberal Jews, but the Orthodox and all across the spectrum. I was in those communities, trying to understand their aspirations, their needs, and making clear that I wanted to be a leader for all of them. I think our leaders need to do that, whether they're Democrat or Republican. I don't think we can allow ourselves to tribalize this great country. And I think Justin talks about that, the difference between those who try to divide and those who try to bring us together. And actually, I think in one of his op-ed pieces gives advice, small things that President Biden can do, besides, as he claimed, as he described, the passionate rhetoric of that, speech, the importance of trying to even things out in a way that make people feel like we all have a level, fair playing field. And that's true for not just people of color, but whites as well. I think this whole notion that every time somebody makes a dumb statement that they should be canceled for the rest of their life, I just don't buy it. Everybody's made dumb statements in their lives, and I think we need to be a little more tolerant of one another, willing to educate people, not just scream at them. And I tried to do that. Wasn't always, successful, but I always tried to identify those commonalities that we share. And I think that's what more of us have to do, both Democrat and Republican. Right now, we're living in a very polarized time, Molly and Justin, all of you. I think we know that. I've never seen, probably not, I'm a history major, probably not since the Civil War have we been so divided. But we had a great leader who, in his second inauguration speech, talked about us coming together, talking about, identifying our commonalities. He was ready before he was assassinated to accept the Confederacy and the Southern states into the great federation that we are and republic that we are. And I think we can't allow the dividers to rule the day. And dividers, by the way, not just on the right. I come from the left. I'm a progressive, unabashedly, but I'm not a born-again progressive. I was a progressive in the 1960s. When I watch these people screaming constantly from either side, all they're doing is tearing the country apart. And I think we need people that want to bring us together. That's what I tried to talk about in the governor's race. An economy that's working for more people. In California, the 5th largest economy in the world, with the highest rate of poverty in the United States of America, a level of poverty that you have to ask yourself, is this really the way it's supposed to work? Can we do better than this? I think those are the leveling that playing field helps all of us acknowledge our common journey for a better life here in this country and in the world.
And I think what you actually understood intuitively as a political candidate and eventually an elected official are two dirty secrets that statisticians otherwise study. And that is that even though 60% of the United States population today is white, 70% of voters are white. And I'm sure a similar, discrepancy was true in Los Angeles and California at the time that you ran. And then secondly, that whiteness itself is something totally subjective, and it's subject to how you feel, about yourself, how you perceive yourself, but how you think other people perceive you. And there has historically been a sort of aspirational whiteness, I think, in the United States among minorities who want to shed the baggage of structural discrimination and disadvantage in our country and adopt and assimilate into whiteness. And that, vexing pressure to assimilate and also to reinforce the politics of whiteness and race continue. And so I just think that, in your public statements and the rhetoric that you led and the policies that you tried to pursue, I think you intuitively understood that it wasn't going to be possible to ever be just a Latino candidate alone. And I think that's really actually powerful, but I don't know that the electoral incentives today, will create the same kind of intuition among contemporary candidates.
Well, and let's be clear. I wasn't successful in my last run. Right now, I think we're living at a time when people don't want to hear one another. They don't want to listen. They think they have all the answers. They like screaming and pointing fingers instead of, embracing one another and working on the challenges that we face. And I refuse to accept that paradigm. And I don't believe it's the future of the United States of America. I really do believe. I don't wrap myself around the flag, and I don't believe that if you burn the flag or kneel down, don't refuse to kneel down to the flag, that you're an American. I'm a proud American, and I do believe in this country. And I believe that we will overcome this polarization. You are a history buff and major and professor, and in many ways we know that history is cyclical, and there will be a better time in this country. As we all mix more and more. I joke with a friend of mine who's a candidate for mayor of Los Angeles. Her children are Mexican, and they call them Blaxican. More and more we're mixed. I've been at the Seder's, where a Jewish family has Latinos, African Americans, and Asians that are now their grandchildren. And I think over time we're going to realize that this zero-sum game of race is not going to work for us. We have real existential threats in the world to our democracy, to the peace in the world, that require us to come together. And we have a real opportunity to be a better America that I think require us to come together.
If you're in the audience, please keep those questions coming. We've had a few come in so far, and we're going to get to them in just a second. But before I do that, I just want to go back to you one more time, Justin. As you mentioned, as you both have alluded to, there are powerful incentives for politicians to be divisive rather than unifying, and whether it's human nature or socially constructive, that sort of deep pull of identity and tribalism is so powerful in our human communities. And there was. And we do see both parties seeing advantages. There was a time when the Democratic Party thought that the increasing diversity of our country meant that there would be a permanent Democratic majority. Why didn't that happen? And how do the incentives shape this political conversation?
Sure. Well, let's start off with why that didn't happen. And the philosophy or the approach that you were describing, Molly, was the idea that demography is destiny. That was the sort of slogan during some of the early Obama years. And that idea was proven false, not only with, if you look at current electoral trends, but it was always lazy. It was always complacent to presume that, people's politics were going to be so heavily determined by their identity, that they're going to be sort of sheep to their identities and to identity politics. but also lazy that it suggested that the party didn't have to evolve with contemporary events. It suggested that they could rest on their laurels and just allow demographic change to let rip. And of course, it failed. And any Democrat will say and point out the nature of American electoral institutions, which disadvantage the Democratic Party right now because of the favor and the weight, outsized weight given to rural regions, to whiter districts, to states, as opposed to actually population distributions. But at the same time, it's becoming increasingly clear that demography is not destiny. Even if it never, predicts our population, it doesn't predict how people think. You have to persuade. You still have to go out and come up with ideas. You still have to actually think on your feet and evolve with the challenges facing the country. And so it was always a lazy approach to politics. And similarly, to answer your other question, Molly, about what we do is we have to actually think. We have to actually create. We have to create a new identity for the country, and that is such a difficult, problem for Democrats, who really have always thought of nationalism as being something foul and vile and left to only the right. But it's too powerful of a sentiment to allow the right to monopolize. Democrats, if they want to be successful, the left more broadly, have to create a more civic sense of nationalism that is as inclusive of all as it is also exclusive, something that gives Americans and their constituents a sense of distinction and distinguishment. And that threading of the needle between being inclusive and exclusive, it's almost an oxymoron. It sounds incredibly daunting, but that's actually the work of politics. That's the work of leaders. They thread that needle and they look for what actually unites a country. And if it's enough of a priority, then they pursue it and they deal with the sacrifices it comes with. And unfortunately, that amount of courage and that amount of creativity is in very short supply. But if we are going to surmount what I believe is the greatest social challenge facing this country for the next generation, it's going to take that hard work.
And Mayor, you talked about wrapping yourself in the flag, which, as Justin mentioned, can be offensive even in some circles. What do you make of his sort of call for a new sort of liberal nationalism?
I think it conforms with what my own experience is, that let's focus on what we have in common. I know in one of his books he talks about, or at least in an article that I read, about organizations like AmeriCorps. Okay, we don't believe in the draft any longer. I think there are some that disagree with that notion. Some kind of service is important. You get to meet a young man or a woman from a small town in Alabama, East LA, or somewhere in the Midwest. You get to realize that there are things you agree on and things that you disagree on. And from my vantage point, I think that there is nothing wrong with, you called it a liberal nationalism. I think this notion of civitas, that, inherent to living in this country, and not just being a citizen, by the way, but inherent to being able to live in this country, we should all give back. And there should be opportunities for us to give back, and all of us, not just the poor and the middle class, but all of us to give back. I think a notion of civitas that not uniquely American, but uniquely helps us come together, I think is important. And I agree with that notion.
But the most radical thing that I think Mayor Villaraigosa said in our conversation so far was the way he championed heritage, because that is something I think that is such a faux pas right now on the left of American politics. There's almost a sort of self-flogging going on. The idea that if you're honoring heritage, revering those who came, who have been in the United States, of course, who were predominantly white historically, that you're doing something wrong, and that it's a slight against, the emergent population dynamics. But actually, that's exactly what you have to do to win. You can't exclude white working class people and just redline 40% of the country. You can't exclude white people more broadly from the country of the future that progressives are pushing the country towards. And I think that that is radical right now. And even if it was sort of de rigueur, in the time when the mayor won those elections in the 1990s and 2000s, it is quickly fallen out of fashion, and I think to our own detriment.
Well, that's a great segue to this question that we have from the audience, which is, what policies have the best chance to cross all ethnic communities? Mayor, you want to take that?
Yeah, when I remember I think it was 1996 or 7, the Latino caucus in the legislature, it was 97, I was majority leader. And they wanted to do, the most, the ethnic community that with least amount of healthcare were Latinos. And they wanted me to do a bill for Latino healthcare. And I said to them, I think they were 69% of the uninsured. And I said to them, why would we want to do that? I said, they'll give us $5 million, a few $1 million. They'll put a sunset on it because it's just for one group. Why don't we say all kids ought to have health care? I did the Healthy Families program. I was able to get Pete Wilson, a Republican governor, to sign on to that. Some 750,000 kids got health care. It was inclusive. It was uniting. Yes, 69% of them were Latino, but what did that have to do with the price of wheat in, Iowa? At the end of the day, I picked the right state. But at the end of the day, what we're looking for, I think, is to identify commonalities. I think another area, so healthcare is one. I think another, in a country where we don't have universal healthcare, where we don't have, government paid for healthcare. I think another area is education. A lot of people talk about reparations, and particularly increasingly, in the Democratic Party. And I tell people, that's a very divisive issue in the country right now. You want to bring the people together? Let's educate every kid. Let's make sure our urban schools are as good as the private schools that the wealthy send their kids to. Let's do everything we can to level the playing field. How about an economy that works for more people? In the governor's race, wherever I went, I talked about the fact that, if we believe in capitalism and believe that it is the best way to organize ourselves economically, then we have to agree that it should lift up more people. It can't leave so many people behind. So I think the economy, I think healthcare, I think education are ways that we can come together as a country and not be so divisive, in just focusing on race now and ethnicity. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't ever speak about those issues. They're real. They're before us. We should talk about them, but let's work on them in a way that brings people together. And I just think too many people on both sides are unwilling to do that. I used to talk, and I still believe, in the radical center. What is that? It's the place that if you look at the history of politics, we're always trying to bring people, to get to a majority. That means you have to, nibble around the edges to do that. That means you have to identify the commonalities that we confront in order to do that. And I think those are three areas where we could really bring people together and not be so damn divisive. And so, and finger pointing and, this notion that somebody should have to pay for, and I'm not now talking about reparations, for the rest of their life for what their great-great-grandfather who lived in Europe at the time that our forefathers were doing the things that they did. Come on. I think we can come together as a country, be a better place, a more perfect union, in a much more positive an uplifting way for more people than the way we're currently, tracking ourselves, just pointing fingers at one another and screaming.
Justin, I'm going to ask you a question, but first, Mayor, I apologize. You're a politician and you mentioned the state of Iowa. So by political reporter code, I'm required to ask you if you're running for president.
No, right.
Just checking the box. But Justin, I want to go to you on this next question from the audience, which is, sorry.
I came in third for governor of California. So
sounds like a good launching pad to me.
Presidential aspirations are on the side.
Well, why else does anybody go to Iowa?
I love Iowa, as a matter of fact. I've been there.
It's a nice place.
So Justin, the question from the audience, which I think is, again, a very good segue from what the mayor was talking about, has the left gone too far on identity politics, or is the right overreacting?
Well, look, we're sort of broad brushing the left and the right, and there's certainly pockets of the left that have gone too far. But those who have gone too far have the luxury of being able to go too far because they represent, very monolithic, districts, and they'll be reelected no matter what. So they can take these kinds of moves and politically survive them. So, again, this is a product of electoral incentives. If people had to face, these folks who are, leaning into identity politics had to face a more general electorate that was more of a cross section of America, they wouldn't do these things. So, yeah, I think that they're both guilty of identity politics, but the ones who are the most guilty are the ones who can afford to be, I think. No one's leading with identity politics, and sort of bringing people along with them. They're often succumbing to the pressures of identity politics because of the short-term incentives to win. And we have to change that dynamic in the country by basically not allowing politicians to win by dividing us. I think across all of those are various policy areas that Mayor Villaraigosa was just discussing. There should be a criterion that unifies all discussions of what we do, and we should ask ourselves: is the act that we are about to pursue going to break down boundaries between us, social boundaries, or is it going to reinforce them? Is it going to thicken them? Are we actually, promoting a greater sense of social trust and cohesion, or are we undermining that trust? And I think in so much of our politics today, if you really look at it, they're benefiting specific groups, or they're sort of signaling to certain groups without actually signaling to the whole. That's just not healthy in the long run, even if it's, helpful and instrumental in the short run. With those policy areas, Molly, that Mayor Villaraigosa was just discussing, these are cross-cutting areas. Everyone needs healthcare. Everyone cares about, education. Even if you don't have kids in public education, you might, one day. And you want a better country because of it. It's as nationalist of an issue as it gets. But the problem is that inside of these issues, there are fearmongers and people who are exclusive in their approach to politics that are trying to tell you that if you help with healthcare generally, you're really actually helping minorities out. But actually, unlike California, in the nation as a whole, more white people actually had insurance extended to them than non-whites with the expansion of Obamacare. And if you look at the politics of education, there's this perception that you're helping a bunch of undocumented immigrants, when you improve schools and allow them to have access to it. But actually, there have been numerous educational studies that show that white students who are in classes with the undocumented in more diverse spaces actually perform better on standardized tests. And so these are not policies that are exclusively in the interest of certain minority communities. They're in everybody's interest. And the more that we can actually convey that and communicate that, the better off we're going to be.
Well, go ahead.
Something that you mentioned, I think you're right about, Justin, that I think is important. One of the things when I was mayor, we increased the graduation rate by 60%. We went from 1 out of 3 failing schools to 1 out of 10. I didn't talk about Latino kids as much, and that's 78% of LA Unified School District are Latino kids, and 95% are of color. But what I talked about was in a knowledge economy where your brain power is, the motor force of that economy, educating everybody's in our interest. This is, I didn't always speak about the ethnic and racial implications of it, though I did raise those issues from time to time. I also talked about, hey, this is important to all of us. If they're going to be the future of the state, then we better educate them in a world where the knowledge economy is dominant. So there are ways to explain a lot of this that isn't so divisive and brings us together and appeals to, people's intelligence, one, and two, their common interest.
Well, we are about out of time, and that actually strikes me as a perfect note to end on, sort of bringing all these threads together. So thank you for that, Mayor Villaraigosa. I know we could go on for much, much longer discussing all of these issues with both of you, but that does bring an end to today's program. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'd like to encourage everyone to purchase this important and fascinating new book, Majority Minority, wherever books are sold. I'm Molly Ball, and this Commonwealth program is now adjourned.